It started the day we buried my wife. The sky that morning was the color of old tin, dull, heavy, without mercy. The kind of sky she used to say made the world look tired. There were only 15 people at the service, maybe fewer. The wind carried the smell of damp earth and flowers that had already started to wilt. I stood there in my black coat, my hands trembling inside the pockets, and I realized my son wasn't coming. At first, I thought there must have been a delay. A flat tire. A traffic jam. A mistake in the directions. But by the time the priest started speaking, I'd stopped pretending. His chair at the front row stayed empty, as if the absence itself wanted to be noticed. I remember staring at that chair longer than at the coffin. Our boy, David, had always been close to his mother. Or at least that's what I used to think. She adored him in the way only mothers can, unconditionally, blindly. When he got married to Rachel, she welcomed the girl with open arms. She used to call her our second daughter. And yet, on the day she was lowered into the ground, that same girl posted a picture of herself smiling over a birthday cake with the caption, "Best day ever." I saw it on Facebook that night. I wasn't looking for it, it just appeared the way pain sometimes does when you least expect it. My son stood behind her in the photo, his arm around her waist, his grin wide and easy. I zoomed in just to be sure. The same jacket I'd given him last Christmas. The same ring he'd inherited from me when he turned 30. He hadn't just missed the funeral, he'd celebrated while I stood by his mother's grave alone. People told me to forgive. "He's young," they said. "He didn't know how to handle grief." But David wasn't young. He was 35, old enough to know what death means. Old enough to drive 2 hours to say goodbye. The house was too quiet after that. I caught myself setting 2 plates for dinner out of habit, or glancing at her chair when I told a joke to no one. The silence after loss isn't just empty, it's loud, echoing through every small thing you used to share. On the 3rd night, I poured myself a drink, bourbon, the kind she never liked, and sat by the window watching the porch light flicker. A part of me hoped David would call, even if it was just to apologize. He didn't. Instead, I got a message from Rachel. "Hope the service went well. Sorry we couldn't make it. You know how birthdays are." I remember reading that line over and over. You know how birthdays are. As if grief should schedule itself around cake and candles. That was the moment something in me shifted, quietly, like a door locking from the inside. For weeks after, I tried to make sense of it. I told myself maybe they couldn't afford the trip, maybe there were reasons I didn't know. But then I saw the photos, the restaurant, the friends, the gifts. They'd spent the weekend at a lakeside resort, the same place I used to take them fishing when David was a kid. He'd taken his wife to the spot where his mother once laughed, and he'd toasted to her birthday while I scattered ashes in that same lake years before. Grief has a way of rewriting memories. You start questioning what was ever real. I began to wonder if my wife had seen this distance coming, if she'd felt it in the way David stopped calling as often, or how he spoke to her less tenderly once Rachel came along. Maybe she knew her place in his heart had already been replaced. I didn't hate him then. Not yet. Hate takes time, it's patient. What I felt was deeper, a hollowing out, like the floor beneath me had quietly rotted. Every man, at some point in his life, discovers what it means to lose more than he can forgive. The night before her memorial, I sat by her old piano, the one she refused to sell even when times got tough. I opened the lid and found her sheet music still marked with pencil notes, in her neat handwriting. She'd written the date of David's wedding on one of the corners, next to the song she played that day. "You are my sunshine." I touched those words with my fingers, and for the first time in years, I cried without shame. When the tears stopped, I looked at my reflection in the piano's glossy surface, tired eyes, gray hair, bourbon breath, and I realized something simple but final: the boy I'd raised no longer existed. And yet, despite everything, I didn't block his number. I didn't cut him off. Because grief does something strange, it keeps you hoping even when the world has given you every reason not to. I told myself, maybe he'll come by. Maybe he'll remember what kind of man his mother wanted him to be. Weeks passed. Then months. The phone stayed silent. But silence, I would learn, is not the end of a story. It's the beginning of one. Because 3 months later, on a quiet Sunday morning, I heard a knock at the door. And when I opened it, it was David. When I opened the door that morning, I almost didn't recognize him. David stood there in a coat too expensive for his age, with that clean, city-polished look that never sat right with me. His hair was slicked back, his shoes spotless, like he'd walked straight out of a magazine ad, not my life. But it wasn't the clothes that caught me off guard. It was his expression. Calm. Practiced. Like he'd rehearsed this visit in the mirror before driving down. "Hey, Dad," he said. Not hi. Not how are you holding up. Just that casual tone people use when bumping into an old neighbor. I stepped aside, and he walked in without waiting for an invitation. The same way he used to as a kid, except now he didn't belong here anymore. He looked around, eyes drifting over the furniture, the framed photos, the piano. "You haven't changed much," he said. "Mom would have wanted you to keep it this way." I didn't respond. I just watched him, this stranger who carried my blood but not my warmth. After a moment, he cleared his throat. "Listen, I know I should have come sooner. Rachel kept saying we'd make the trip, but you know how life gets." I almost laughed. You know how life gets. As if I hadn't buried my wife alone. As if the hole in the ground hadn't been deep enough to swallow excuses like that hole. He must have sensed the silence cutting into him, because he went on, talking faster. "Anyway, I'm here now. And I actually wanted to talk to you about something important. Thought it'd be better in person." That's when I noticed it, the folder in his hand. A thick tan envelope, the kind you don't bring for family visits. "What's that?" I asked. He smiled, the same smile he used to flash when he wanted something as a boy. "Just some paperwork. Nothing serious. Rachel and I are trying to buy a new house, bigger place, good neighborhood, near her parents. But well, banks these days are a pain. They need collateral." The words started lining up in my head before he even said the next part. I already knew the shape of the ask. It was written all over his polished shoes and borrowed confidence. "I was hoping," he said, lowering his voice like he was offering me a favor instead of asking for one, "you could co-sign the loan with us. Just temporary. Once we get approved and refinance, your name's off. Simple." I looked at him for a long time. He didn't flinch, didn't even blink. "You didn't come for your mother's funeral," I said finally. He exhaled, like a man who'd expected a confrontation but hoped to skip it. "Dad, we've been over this." "No," I said, my voice steady, quiet. "We haven't." He rubbed his temple, the way Rachel probably did when she got impatient. "It was bad timing, okay? Rachel's birthday was the same weekend, we had guests, we couldn't just cancel everything. I thought you'd understand." Understand. The word stung. I walked to the window, watched the pale light on the old oak tree she planted years ago. "Your mother," I said slowly, "gave up everything so you could have a better life. She worked double shifts, sold her jewelry, skipped her own treatments some months because she didn't want you to worry about the bills. And when it was her time to go, you were blowing out candles 200 miles away." His voice turned sharp. "I'm sorry, all right? But she's gone, Dad. Sitting around feeling guilty won't bring her back," Rachel said. "And that's where he lost me," Rachel said. There was a time when David spoke from his heart. Now he spoke through his wife's mouth. "She said what?" I asked, turning to face him. He shifted his weight. "That Mom wouldn't want me to be miserable. That funerals are for the living, not the dead. She thought it'd be better to remember her the way she was, happy, alive." I nodded slowly. "And did she also think you should use your father's house as collateral for a mortgage you can't afford?" His jaw tightened. "You make it sound like I'm robbing you. I'm asking for help." "No," I said. "You're asking for permission to forget what you did," The silence after that was thick. He looked at me with something between pity and irritation, the look of a man who thought he'd outgrown his own father. "You know, Dad," he said finally, his tone soft but poisoned. "You've always held on to things too long. Maybe that's why Mom." He stopped himself, but it was too late. I stepped closer. "Finish it," I said quietly. He swallowed. "Nothing. Forget it." I could feel my pulse in my throat, slow and steady. Not anger, clarity. The kind that only comes when the last illusion dies. He sighed, ran a hand through his perfect hair, and tried again with that salesman charm he'd inherited from nobody in this family. "Look, I didn't come to fight. We just need a signature. You're not losing anything. Once we sell the old condo, we'll pay off everything. Easy." I walked to the desk where my wife's photo stood. She was smiling, wind in her hair, the lake behind her sparkling like the world was still kind. I traced her face with my thumb. "She always said money shows you who people really are," I said softly. "I used to think she meant other people." He frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" I turned, meeting his eyes for the first time since he'd walked in. "It means you didn't just miss your mother's funeral, David. You buried something else that day, your decency." He blinked, caught off guard by how calm my voice was. I didn't shout. Didn't curse. Just spoke the truth he'd spent years avoiding. He gathered his folder, visibly frustrated. "If this is how it's gonna be, fine. I'll figure something out. But don't expect me to keep coming back if you're gonna hold this over my head forever." I smiled faintly. "You won't have to worry about that." He left without another word. The door clicked shut behind him, echoing through the house like a final nail. For a long time, I stood there, staring at the dent his shoes had left on the mat, two perfect impressions in the dust. Then I turned to my wife's photo again. "Don't worry," I whispered. "He'll come back." Because I knew my son. He wouldn't quit when he needed something. He'd come back, and when he did, I'd be ready. That night, I took the bourbon to the porch and sat under the same flickering light as before. But this time, I didn't drink to forget. I drank to remember. Every word, every gesture, every ounce of cold entitlement in his voice. Because grief was no longer what haunted me, it was purpose. And in that quiet, I understood something dangerous and clear. Revenge isn't born from anger. It's born from recognition. After he left, the house fell back into that hollow stillness, the kind that makes even the clocks tick louder, as if time itself wants to fill the silence. I didn't move for a while. His coffee cup sat untouched on the table, steam long gone. The faint imprint of his hand was still visible on the folder he'd carried, the folder that had left a faint dust ring on the wood. That small mark stayed there for days, and every time I walked past it, it reminded me what his visit had really been, not reconciliation, not remorse, just business. The night grew colder. I turned off the lights and sat by the window again, watching the faint reflection of my face on the glass. It wasn't anger I saw there. It was fatigue, the kind that settles into your bones after decades of trying to do right by people who stopped deserving it. That's when I made my decision, though, at the time, I wouldn't have called it revenge. It felt more like correction. I went to my office, pulled open the old wooden drawer, and found the envelope my wife had labeled in her neat handwriting, "Will, draft copy." We'd updated it a few years before she got sick. Back then, everything seemed simple. David was our only child, our pride, our legacy. We had agreed that, when our time came, the house, the savings, the lake cabin, everything, would go to him. She wanted him to have stability. She said, "He'll understand the value of where he came from." She was wrong. I sat at that desk until dawn, rereading the will line by line. Each clause now felt like a conversation we never finished. Her signature at the bottom, Margaret R. Thompson, seemed to look back at me, half questioning, half forgiving. I poured myself another bourbon and whispered, "I'm not doing this out of hate, Maggie. I'm doing this for the truth." The next day, I called our family lawyer, James Whitmore. He'd known me for 20 years, a man with too much patience and not enough illusions. When I told him I wanted to revise the will, he paused for a long time. "Tom," he said carefully, "are you sure? We can set up a trust or—" "No," I interrupted. "I don't want a trust. I want a lesson." James sighed. "A lesson?" "Yes. For David. One that doesn't need words." He hesitated again but didn't argue. "All right," he said. "Come by tomorrow. We'll go over everything." When I hung up, I realized how calm I felt. Not satisfied, not vindictive, just steady. For the first time since her funeral, I had a reason to get out of bed. That evening, I found myself in the attic, sorting through old boxes. My wife's photos, David's school trophies, yellowed report cards, fishing rods that hadn't seen water in years. Memories. The kind that once warmed you, now just ache. In one of the boxes, I found an old cassette player and a tape labeled "David Graduation Speech." Curiosity got the better of me. I blew the dust off, popped it in, and pressed play. The audio cracked, then his young voice came through, full of hope, pride, and innocence. "I want to thank my parents," he'd said, "for teaching me what it means to stand by the people you love." I stopped the tape halfway through. That boy, the one who'd said those words, didn't exist anymore. Somewhere between that speech and the day he chose a birthday over a funeral, he'd sold that version of himself for convenience. I took a deep breath and started writing notes for the lawyer meeting. Not the usual details, assets, properties, or insurance. No, I was writing conditions. Not cruel ones. Just fair. Poetic. One, the main house, where he grew up, would not go directly to him. It would be held by the estate for 5 years. During that time, it would serve as a shelter for single mothers in the community, the kind my wife used to volunteer for. 2, the savings account, half of it would be split into scholarships for art students from low-income families, in her name. She loved music and painting. It felt right. 3, the lake cabin, the place we'd built memories, would go to the first family member who visited her grave every year on her birthday for 5 consecutive years. That one made me smile. I didn't write his name anywhere. Not yet. I wanted him to earn the right to appear on that paper again. When I showed James the draft the next morning, he read it slowly, then looked up at me with that expression only old lawyers can manage, part admiration, part worry. "You're serious about this?" he said. "Dead serious." He adjusted his glasses. "You know this will make him angry." I nodded. "He's already angry, James. Just at the wrong things." James tapped the paper. "You understand what you're doing, right? You're not punishing him for missing the funeral. You're punishing him for becoming someone you can't respect." I thought about that for a long moment. Then I said, "No. I'm giving him a chance to remember who he was." We finalized the draft that afternoon. I signed it, dated it, and sealed it in the same tan folder he'd brought to my house. The symmetry didn't escape me. When I got home, I placed the new will in my safe and sat down at the piano again. Her piano. I hadn't touched it since that night after the funeral. My fingers hesitated over the keys before pressing out the first few notes of "You Are My Sunshine." It sounded rough, uneven, but honest. Halfway through the melody, I stopped and laughed quietly to myself. Revenge was a strange thing. People imagined it loud, violent, cruel. But this was quiet. Gentle, even. Like pruning a dying branch so the tree could grow again. Over the next few weeks, I went about my days as if nothing had changed. I tended the garden, paid the bills, took long drives to the lake. But something inside me had settled. My wife's photo no longer looked like a wound, it looked like a promise kept. Then, one evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I saw a familiar car pull into the driveway. White. Polished. A Tesla, humming quietly like guilt dressed in luxury. I knew before he even stepped out, he was back. And this time, he wouldn't be asking. He'd be begging. When David's car disappeared down the street, I didn't close the door right away. I stood there, holding the frame like it was the only thing keeping me upright. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and rain, that sharp scent that always lingers after someone leaves in a hurry. Inside, the house looked the same as before he came, yet it felt smaller, heavier, like his presence had rearranged the gravity inside it. His untouched coffee cup still sat on the table, leaving a ring on the wood that would dry into a permanent reminder. I stared at it for a long time, realizing something unsettling. His visit hadn't brought closure. It had reopened something I thought was buried with her. I didn't go to bed that night. Sleep felt pointless. Instead, I poured myself another bourbon, not for the burn, but for the silence that came after the swallow. Outside, the porch light flickered. The bulb had been doing that for weeks, ever since the storm. I kept meaning to fix it, but every time I thought about climbing that ladder, I'd hear her voice in my head. "Don't risk your neck over a light, Tom. Some things are better left dim." She was right, as always. But not about this. That's when the thought came, slow, deliberate, uninvited. Not anger, not vengeance, just an idea. He shouldn't inherit her world. Because that's what it was, her world. The house, the piano, the garden she tended every Sunday, the quilt she made when we were first married. Every inch of this place carried her fingerprints, her patience, her care. And the boy who couldn't show up to say goodbye didn't deserve to own it. I walked into the study, the smell of old wood and paper grounding me. There, in the bottom drawer, was the envelope marked "Will, draft copy." My wife had written it in her soft cursive, the same way she labeled everything, from spice jars to Christmas ornaments. I held it for a long time before opening it, as though I needed her permission. We had written it together years ago, sitting at this very desk. I remembered how she'd smiled through the discussion, calling it a silly exercise in premature planning. She had believed in continuity, in family as something that mended itself naturally. "He'll understand someday," she said about David, back when he was still just a distracted young man, not this entitled stranger in an expensive coat. But that night, I saw the document differently. Every clause, every promise suddenly felt naive. It wasn't a will. It was a reward for someone who had already stopped being part of the family that built it. I poured another drink and sat with that thought until dawn broke pale through the curtains. That was the moment it crystallized, not a plan, but a principle. If love and loyalty are a choice, then inheritance should be too. I wasn't going to destroy him. That would have been too easy, too small. No, I wanted something that would reach him. Something that would make him stop and see himself clearly for the first time in years. The next morning, I called James Whitmore, our old family lawyer. I'd known him since before David was born, an honest man, quiet and measured, the kind who read contracts like gospel. "Tom," he said when he picked up, his voice still thick from sleep. "Everything all right?" "I need to change the will," I told him. There was a pause. "Change it how?" "Let's just say, it needs to reflect reality." He sighed the way only men in their 60s can, with resignation, experience, and a trace of sorrow. "Come by the office tomorrow. We'll go through it." When I hung up, I felt lighter though not happier. Purpose is a strange drug. It steadies the hands but hardens the heart. That afternoon, I drove to the lake cabin. It was empty, quiet except for the wind pressing against the shutters. The same cabin where we'd spent our last anniversary. She had sat on the porch with a blanket around her shoulders, watching the reflection of the sky in the water, and said something I didn't understand back then. "The cruelest thing a parent can do is raise a child who believes love is automatic." Now I did. Inside, I found her gardening gloves on the windowsill, stiff with age, a single dried petal trapped inside one of them. I put them back down gently and sat on the old rocking chair she loved. I stayed there until the sun started sinking into the lake, watching the world turn gold, and I thought, this is what he gave up, not money, not property, but moments like this. The next day, I sat across from James in his office. The place smelled of coffee and legal paper. He adjusted his glasses, scanning the document as I spoke. I don't want to cut him off, I said. I want him to earn it. He looked up. You want to create conditions? Yes. But not cruel ones. Just meaningful. He leaned back, studying me. You realize this kind of thing tends to stir resentment. I smiled faintly. Resentment's already there, James. This might at least make it useful. We worked through the afternoon. Line by line, we rewrote everything she and I had once built. The main house would not transfer automatically. It would serve, for the next 5 years, as a community shelter in her name, the Margaret Thompson Home for Women and Children. I'd seen her dream about that once, late at night, talking about how she wished she could help more mothers like the ones she met at the hospital. The savings would be divided, half into the shelter's maintenance, and half into a scholarship for local students pursuing art, music, or teaching. My wife used to say, "We don't leave money behind, we leave chances." And the lake cabin, that was the one I saved for last. It would go to the first family member who visited her grave every year on her birthday for 5 consecutive years. Not out of guilt, not out of obligation, but out of love that remembered without needing an audience. When I finished dictating that clause, James looked at me over the rim of his glasses. You know he'll never do it. Maybe not, I said. But maybe his children will. He nodded slowly. You've thought about this. Every night since the funeral, I admitted. We signed the draft that evening. As I put the pen down, I felt a strange calm settle in my chest, not satisfaction, but peace. The kind of peace that comes from knowing you've stopped waiting for apologies that will never arrive. When I got home, I went to her piano. It had been months since I'd dared to touch it. The cover was dusty, the keys slightly yellowed, but it still held its tune. I played the first few notes of "You Are My Sunshine," her favorite song. My fingers trembled, but the melody came through, uneven, but honest. Halfway through, I stopped and looked at her photo on the mantel. I did what you would have done, Maggie, I whispered. You taught him to give. I'm just teaching him to remember. That night, I sat on the porch until the stars came out. The bourbon stayed untouched beside me. The cicadas hummed, and the air smelled of wet grass and lilacs. Somewhere deep in that stillness, I understood something simple but final. Revenge isn't always fire. Sometimes it's a mirror. And in the reflection, I no longer saw a broken man. I saw a father who'd finally learned how to stop forgiving people who never asked to be forgiven. The next morning, the phone rang. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. Dad? It was David. His voice was different this time, less sure, more careful. Hey, I said, neutral. I've been thinking, he started. About what you said the other day. Maybe I came off wrong. Rachel thinks. Of course she did. He hesitated. Look, we're having some issues with the loan. The bank wants more collateral. I figured if I could just use. Not now, David. He paused, thrown off by my tone. Are you okay? I'm fine, I said. But you should probably come by. There's something you'll need to see soon. What is it? You'll find out. When I hung up, I smiled faintly. Not out of malice, but because the timing was perfect. For the first time in years, I wasn't reacting to him. He was reacting to me. And that, I realized, was the quiet birth of my revenge. I've learned that when people talk about revenge, they always picture fire, something explosive, dramatic, destructive. But the real kind, the kind that actually works, doesn't burn. It waits. It listens. It prepares. After that last call from David, I didn't hear from him for nearly 2 months. At first, I thought maybe he'd finally understood that some doors, once closed, should stay that way. But then the emails started. Short, polite, efficient. Dad, hope you're well. Quick question, are you still working with your old accountant? Hey, could you send me the contact info for your insurance guy? Just checking, do you still own the lake property outright? He was circling back. Testing the waters. I didn't answer a single one. Instead, I began the slow work of preparation. The first step wasn't legal. It was personal. I cleaned the house. Top to bottom. Every photo, every box, every drawer that still smelled faintly of her perfume. I didn't do it to move on, I did it to make space. The home had become a museum of guilt and nostalgia, and I needed it to become a stage. Every piece would matter later. I started in her garden. The soil had hardened over winter, but beneath it, life still lingered. I tilled it, trimmed the dead branches, replanted her favorite peonies. The neighbors must have thought I'd finally lost it, digging in the cold like some widower chasing ghosts. But I wasn't chasing, I was setting a scene. Because when David finally showed up again, I wanted him to see that I hadn't decayed. That grief hadn't ruined me. That, in a quiet way, I was thriving without him. Step 2, the paperwork. I met with James twice a week for almost a month. We went through every clause, every signature, every potential loophole. The will wasn't just a document anymore, it was architecture. I added fine print that would make any greedy man pause. The main house was legally tied to the community foundation for 5 years, renewable upon positive review by the shelter board. Any attempt to contest the will would result in the forfeiture of all potential inheritance. The lake cabin clause, the one about the 5-year grave visit, was ironclad. The estate executor, James, would verify it annually, with photographic and written confirmation. James shook his head while drafting. "You're not leaving him much room to maneuver." "That's the point," I said. "He's always relied on shortcuts. This time, there won't be any." After the legal structure was in place, I turned to something more human, the presentation. I began writing letters. Not to David, not yet, but to people who would outlive me. A letter for James, one for the shelter board, one for the scholarship committee. And one, sealed and handwritten, addressed to my son. Each letter began the same way. "If you're reading this, it means I've gone, and you're finally ready to listen." I didn't write with bitterness. I wrote with clarity. I explained the choices, why the house wasn't his, why the money went elsewhere, why I believed a man's worth wasn't measured by what he inherited but by what he learned to cherish too late. And yet, buried between the lines, there was something softer. I didn't want to haunt him, I wanted to wake him. While I worked, the days passed easily. There's a strange peace in planning your own justice. It makes time feel obedient again. One evening, I got a voicemail from him. His tone was different now, strained. "Dad, I'm sorry if I upset you. We're just going through a rough patch financially. Rachel's medical bills piled up. We're behind on mortgage payments. If we lose the house, it's going to destroy her. Please just call me back." I listened twice. Not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted to memorize the sound of his voice when pride finally cracked. There was a tremor there, a reminder of the boy he used to be. For a brief second, I almost called him. Almost. But then I saw her photo again, the one from the lake, sunlight in her hair, and I remembered how she had cried after that birthday weekend he missed her funeral. I could still hear her words. "He's not cruel, Tom. He's careless. And that's worse. Carelessness destroys more than malice ever could." So I didn't call him. Instead, I wrote another note, not to him, but to myself. It said simply, "Justice, not comfort." That became my compass. It was late spring when he finally came back. The garden was blooming, and the air smelled like rain and lilacs. I was out front watering the plants when I saw the white Tesla roll up. He got out slower this time, no swagger, no city polish. There were dark circles under his eyes. His shirt looked slept in. "Dad," he said, walking up to the gate. "Can we talk?" I set the watering can down and nodded toward the porch. "Sure." He sat opposite me, elbows on his knees, eyes darting around like the furniture might attack him. "I didn't mean to ignore Mom's funeral," he said quickly, words tumbling. "You know how Rachel can be, she wanted this big party, friends coming in from out of town, and I raised a hand. You don't have to explain. I stopped needing explanations a long time ago. He swallowed. We're in trouble, Dad. I stayed silent. The loan fell through. Rachel's treatment costs more than we thought. I'm doing everything I can, but... He laughed bitterly. Turns out the market doesn't care how hard you work. I leaned back. Markets rarely do. He rubbed his face, ashamed. Look, I'm not asking for charity. Just a loan. I'll pay it back with interest. You've got savings, right? The cabin? You could use that as collateral. It's just a temporary thing. There it was again, temporary thing. I looked him straight in the eye. You know, I used to believe you'd make something of yourself. You had your mother's kindness once. But somewhere along the way, you traded it for comfort. He shook his head. That's not fair. Fairness, I said softly, isn't the same as justice. He frowned, confused. What are you talking about? I reached into my pocket and pulled out an envelope, not the letter, but one of them. I slid it across the table. What's this? He asked. Instructions, I said. For when I'm gone. He frowned, opening it. Inside was a photocopy of a single page, the front of my will. His eyes scanned the lines quickly, and I watched the exact second he found the words the Margaret Thompson Home for Women and Children. He looked up, face pale. You're donating the house? Yes. He blinked. You can't, Dad, that's my inheritance. Your mother's legacy, I corrected. And she's the one who inspired it. You gave up your right to it the moment you chose convenience over her memory. He stood up, hands trembling. This is insane. You're giving away everything we built. We? I said quietly. You didn't build any of this. You visited once a year to take pictures for your Christmas card. His voice rose. So this is punishment? No, I said. It's education. He stared at me for a long time, jaw tightening, breathing uneven. Then, like the boy I once knew, his eyes softened for just a moment. Dad, please. I messed up, I know that. But you can't just cut me out. I stood and walked to the edge of the porch. The air smelled like wet earth and pine. I didn't cut you out, David. You walked out years ago. I'm just closing the door you left open. He said nothing. Just stood there, chest heaving, the sound of his expensive shoes grinding against the wooden floor. Finally, he muttered, You'll regret this, and walked off. I watched him drive away, faster this time, anger instead of guilt fueling his motion. That night, I called James again. It's done, I said simply. He knew what I meant. We finalized the documents the next morning. He would act as executor when the time came. I gave him copies of the letters, the donation plans, the scholarship outlines. Then, for the first time in months, I slept through the night. In the following weeks, I focused on the shelter plans with the foundation. They wanted to name one of the wings after my wife. I told them to use her maiden name, Margaret Rivers, so David wouldn't realize the connection right away. A small touch, but one that would sting later, when he finally learned the truth. Every decision had meaning now. Even the color of the walls at the shelter, pale blue, her favorite, became part of the story I was leaving behind. I met the young architect overseeing the renovation. She reminded me of my wife at that age, driven, gentle, unpretentious. You're doing a wonderful thing, she said one day. I smiled. Not wonderful, I replied. Necessary. When I think back now, I realize that the real revenge began long before the will. It began in every quiet act of care, every measured silence, every time I chose patience over fury. That's the thing about moral justice. It's not about destruction. It's about contrast. Letting someone stand next to goodness so long that they finally see their own shadow. And when that shadow grows unbearable, they teach themselves the lesson you could never force them to learn. By the time summer came, everything was ready. The legal documents. The letters. The foundation transfers. even the burial arrangements. It was all set, a quiet machinery of truth, waiting for time to turn the gears. And as I sealed the final envelope, I whispered, "You wanted my signature, son. You'll get it. Just not on the paper you expected." I've learned that when people talk about revenge, they always picture fire, something explosive, dramatic, destructive. But the real kind, the kind that actually works, doesn't burn. It waits. It listens. It prepares. After that last call from David, I didn't hear from him for nearly 2 months. At first, I thought maybe he'd finally understood that some doors, once closed, should stay that way. But then the emails started. Short, polite, efficient. "Dad, hope you're well. Quick question, are you still working with your old accountant? Hey, could you send me the contact info for your insurance guy? Just checking, do you still own the lake property outright?" He was circling back, testing the waters. I didn't answer a single one. Instead, I began the slow work of preparation. The first step wasn't legal. It was personal. I cleaned the house. Top to bottom. Every photo, every box, every drawer that still smelled faintly of her perfume. I didn't do it to move on, I did it to make space. The home had become a museum of guilt and nostalgia, and I needed it to become a stage. Every piece would matter later. I started in her garden. The soil had hardened over winter, but beneath it, life still lingered. I tilled it, trimmed the dead branches, replanted her favorite peonies. The neighbors must have thought I'd finally lost it, digging in the cold like some widower chasing ghosts. But I wasn't chasing, I was setting a scene. Because when David finally showed up again, I wanted him to see that I hadn't decayed. That grief hadn't ruined me. That, in a quiet way, I was thriving without him. Step 2, the paperwork. I met with James twice a week for almost a month. We went through every clause, every signature, every potential loophole. The will wasn't just a document anymore, it was architecture. I added fine print that would make any greedy man pause. The main house was legally tied to the community foundation for 5 years, renewable upon positive review by the shelter board. Any attempt to contest the will would result in the forfeiture of all potential inheritance. The lake cabin clause, the one about the 5-year grave visit, was ironclad. The estate executor, James, would verify it annually, with photographic and written confirmation. James shook his head while drafting. "You're not leaving him much room to maneuver." "That's the point," I said. "He's always relied on shortcuts. This time, there won't be any." After the legal structure was in place, I turned to something more human, the presentation. I began writing letters. Not to David, not yet, but to people who would outlive me. A letter for James, one for the shelter board, one for the scholarship committee. And one, sealed and handwritten, addressed to my son. Each letter began the same way. "If you're reading this, it means I've gone, and you're finally ready to listen." I didn't write with bitterness. I wrote with clarity. I explained the choices, why the house wasn't his, why the money went elsewhere, why I believed a man's worth wasn't measured by what he inherited but by what he learned to cherish too late. And yet, buried between the lines, there was something softer. I didn't want to haunt him, I wanted to wake him. While I worked, the days passed easily. There's a strange peace in planning your own justice. It makes time feel obedient again. One evening, I got a voicemail from him. His tone was different now, strained. "Dad, I'm sorry if I upset you. We're just going through a rough patch financially. Rachel's medical bills piled up. We're behind on mortgage payments. If we lose the house, it's going to destroy her. Please, just call me back." I listened twice. Not because I didn't understand, but because I wanted to memorize the sound of his voice when pride finally cracked. There was a tremor there, a reminder of the boy he used to be. For a brief second, I almost called him. Almost. But then I saw her photo again, the one from the lake, sunlight in her hair, and I remembered how she had cried after that birthday weekend he missed her funeral. I could still hear her words. "He's not cruel, Tom. He's careless. And that's worse. Carelessness destroys more than malice ever could. So I didn't call him. Instead, I wrote another note, not to him, but to myself. It said simply, "Justice, not comfort." That became my compass. It was late spring when he finally came back. The garden was blooming, and the air smelled like rain and lilacs. I was out front watering the plants when I saw the white Tesla roll up. He got out slower this time, no swagger, no city polish. There were dark circles under his eyes. His shirt looked slept in. "Dad," he said, walking up to the gate. "Can we talk?" I set the watering can down and nodded toward the porch. "Sure." He sat opposite me, elbows on his knees, eyes darting around like the furniture might attack him. "I didn't mean to ignore Mom's funeral," he said quickly, words tumbling. "You know how Rachel can be. She wanted this big party, friends coming in from out of town, and I raised a hand. "You don't have to explain." "I stopped needing explanations a long time ago." He swallowed. "We're in trouble, Dad." I stayed silent. The loan fell through. Rachel's treatment costs more than we thought. "I'm doing everything I can, but—" He laughed bitterly. "Turns out the market doesn't care how hard you work." I leaned back. "Markets rarely do." He rubbed his face, ashamed. "Look, I'm not asking for charity. Just a loan. I'll pay it back with interest. You've got savings, right? The cabin? You could use that as collateral. It's just a temporary thing." There it was again, temporary thing. I looked him straight in the eye. "You know, I used to believe you'd make something of yourself. You had your mother's kindness once. But somewhere along the way, you traded it for comfort." He shook his head. "That's not fair." "Fairness," I said softly, "isn't the same as justice." He frowned, confused. "What are you talking about?" I reached into my pocket and pulled out an envelope, not the letter, but one of them. I slid it across the table. "What's this?" he asked. "Instructions," I said. "For when I'm gone." He frowned, opening it. Inside was a photocopy of a single page, the front of my will. His eyes scanned the lines quickly, and I watched the exact second he found the words "The Margaret Thompson Home for Women and Children." He looked up, face pale. "You're donating the house?" "Yes." He blinked. "You can't, Dad, that's my inheritance." "Your mother's legacy," I corrected. "And she's the one who inspired it. You gave up your right to it the moment you chose convenience over her memory." He stood up, hands trembling. "This is insane. You're giving away everything we built." "We?" I said quietly. "You didn't build any of this. You visited once a year to take pictures for your Christmas card." His voice rose. "So this is punishment?" "No," I said. "It's education." He stared at me for a long time, jaw tightening, breathing uneven. Then, like the boy I once knew, his eyes softened for just a moment. "Dad, please. I messed up, I know that. But you can't just cut me out." I stood and walked to the edge of the porch. The air smelled like wet earth and pine. "I didn't cut you out, David. You walked out years ago. I'm just closing the door you left open." He said nothing. Just stood there, chest heaving, the sound of his expensive shoes grinding against the wooden floor. Finally, he muttered, "You'll regret this," and walked off. I watched him drive away, faster this time, anger instead of guilt fueling his motion. That night, I called James again. "It's done," I said simply. He knew what I meant. We finalized the documents the next morning. He would act as executor when the time came. I gave him copies of the letters, the donation plans, the scholarship outlines. Then, for the first time in months, I slept through the night. In the following weeks, I focused on the shelter plans with the foundation. They wanted to name one of the wings after my wife. I told them to use her maiden name, Margaret Rivers, so David wouldn't realize the connection right away. A small touch, but one that would sting later, when he finally learned the truth. Every decision had meaning now. Even the color of the walls at the shelter, pale blue, her favorite, became part of the story I was leaving behind. I met the young architect overseeing the renovation. She reminded me of my wife at that age, driven, gentle, unpretentious. "You're doing a wonderful thing," she said one day. I smiled. "Not wonderful," I replied. "Necessary." When I think back now, I realize that the real revenge began long before the will. It began in every quiet act of care, every measured silence, every time I chose patience over fury. That's the thing about moral justice. It's not about destruction. It's about contrast. Letting someone stand next to goodness so long that they finally see their own shadow. And when that shadow grows unbearable, they teach themselves the lesson you could never force them to learn. By the time summer came, everything was ready. The legal documents, the letters, the foundation transfers, even the burial arrangements. It was all set, a quiet machinery of truth, waiting for time to turn the gears. That night, after sealing the last envelope, I walked into the garden and buried something beneath the lilac tree, a small tin box containing our wedding rings, wrapped in her silk scarf. It wasn't symbolic for anyone else, it was for me. A reminder that love, once complete, doesn't rot, it returns to the soil and grows into something new. I brushed the dirt off my hands and whispered, "You wanted my signature, son. You'll get it. Just not on the paper you expected." Then I stood beneath the porch light, no longer flickering, and felt the peace of a man who had already said everything he needed to say. The rest would take care of itself. Death never announces itself politely. It came to me one morning in July, wrapped in sunlight so ordinary it almost felt like mercy. I woke up with a weight in my chest, nothing violent, just an ache that spread like a tide. I knew. There was a strange comfort in that knowing. I'd spent a lifetime fixing things. This, finally, I couldn't fix. And somehow that made everything clear. I showered, shaved, put on the blue shirt Maggie liked, and made myself a modest breakfast: eggs, toast, black coffee. The house was silent except for the creak of the floorboards and the wind brushing against the lilac tree outside. I sat at the table and wrote a final note for James, sealing it beside the letter marked "My son." Then I went out to the porch and watched the garden glow in the early light. It was peaceful, the kind of morning you'd wish on a man who'd already made peace with the world. When the pain sharpened, I didn't call anyone. I simply closed my eyes and let it carry me where it wanted to go. James told me later, at least in my imagination, because I'm gone now, that the paramedics said it was quick. They found me sitting upright, a faint smile on my face, the coffee cup still warm. By noon, the small town already knew. They always do. Neighbors brought flowers. The church rang its bell once. James handled the rest with the precision of a man who's been preparing for years. Within 48 hours, David got the call. He arrived 2 days later, Rachel by his side. The house must have felt foreign to him, its silence accusing, its corners too clean. My photo was on the mantel, beside Maggie's, the two of us caught in a laugh that had outlived both our tempers. James met him in the living room, papers neatly stacked. I'd asked him to wait until David had sat down before handing him the envelope. "This was his instruction," James said. "Everything you need to know is in here." David tore it open. Inside were 4 items. 1. The official copy of my will. 2. A key-labeled cabin. 3. A separate sealed letter with his name in my handwriting. 4. A small photograph, him at age 10, holding the fish he'd caught at the lake. He didn't speak for a long time. Rachel peeked over his shoulder, her painted nails gripping the armrest. Then he flipped through the pages of the will, confusion darkening into disbelief. "The house?" he asked. "Donated?" James nodded. "To the foundation. It's already in process." David's voice broke. "The savings?" "Half to a scholarship fund, half to the shelter." "And the cabin?" James pointed to the clause. "Conditional. 5 consecutive visits to your mother's grave, on her birthday, verified each year." Then, and only then, it becomes yours. Rachel let out a sharp laugh that sounded like glass breaking. That's ridiculous. He can't control us from beyond the grave. James folded his hands calmly. He can. Legally and permanently. If you contest any part of it, you forfeit all rights to the estate. Silence filled the room, thick, claustrophobic. David sank back into the chair, staring at the photograph. I wish I could have seen his face at that moment. Maybe he saw, for the first time, what the word legacy really meant. Later that week, he drove to the lake cabin, the key trembling in his hand. The road hadn't changed much, lined with pine and the faint smell of rain on asphalt. When he stepped inside, he found the place spotless. The fireplace stacked with dry wood, the table polished, 2 coffee mugs set neatly beside a folded flannel shirt, mine. On the table was a small cassette player with a note taped to it, press play. He hesitated, then did. My voice crackled through the static. If you're hearing this, I guess my timing finally worked. I didn't leave you money, David. I left you mirrors. One looks backward, the house you lost. Another looks forward, the place you might still earn. I want you to understand something your mother tried to teach us both. Love without responsibility is just sentiment, and memory without action is useless. There was a pause on the tape, the sound of birds outside, waves against the dock. Then my voice again, softer. You thought this was punishment. It isn't. It's restoration. You took her for granted, and you took me for granted. So I'm giving you 5 chances. 5 years to remember. Bring flowers. Sit beside her. Talk to her. Tell her what's happened in your life, even if no one's listening. If you can do that, not for the inheritance but because you finally understand why it matters, the cabin will be yours. That's my final deal. I love you, son. But love, like anything worth keeping, needs tending. The tape clicked to an end. David sat there for hours. Maybe he cried, maybe he didn't. I'll never know. But when he finally stepped outside, the sun was setting, bleeding gold across the water. For the first time in years, he drove straight to the cemetery. James told me, again, I imagine these things, that the first year, David came alone. He brought a single white rose and stood by her grave for nearly an hour. The following year, he came with his daughter, holding her hand as they placed 2 roses side by side. By the 3rd year, he'd started volunteering at the shelter that bore his mother's name. The staff said he rarely spoke about me, but he always stayed late to fix broken furniture or deliver supplies. Revenge, I've come to understand, isn't about winning. It's about balance. I never wanted him ruined, I wanted him humbled. And that's what time does better than any man, it humbles. On the 5th year, something unexpected happened. The local paper ran a small feature on the anniversary of the shelter's opening. It showed David standing under the new sign, the Margaret Rivers Home for Women and Children. His smile looked tired but real. Below the article was a short quote from him. My father used to say that justice isn't loud. It's quiet, like forgiveness finally learned the difference between words and actions. That night, he drove back to the cabin alone. There, on the table, was a final envelope James had been instructed to leave once the 5th visit was confirmed. Inside was the property deed, and another letter. You kept your promise. I suppose that means I can keep mine. The cabin is yours now, but don't think of it as an inheritance. Think of it as a reminder that even the broken things in life can be repaired if you stop pretending they were never broken. He sat on the porch until dawn, listening to the same lake where he once learned to fish. The wind carried the smell of lilacs from miles away, the ones growing by the house he no longer owned. Sometimes I wonder, if ghosts could feel satisfaction, would this be it? Not triumph, but release. To know that the world went on not in bitterness, but in balance. People say revenge is poison. Maybe they're right. But I've learned that, in small doses, it can also be medicine, bitter, precise, healing in its own cruel honesty. And if somewhere, in that quiet morning light, my son looked toward the water and whispered, I'm sorry, then everything I did, The letters, the clauses, the waiting, was worth it. Because that's when justice finally became love again. But the story didn't end at the cabin. Justice rarely stops at the signature, it ripples. The following spring, David began restoring the old dock. The boards had rotted in places, nails rusted through, yet he refused to hire help. Locals said he worked until dusk each day, hammer echoing across the lake like a heartbeat. When asked why, he'd simply answer, "Because it's mine now, and I need to earn it." On weekends he'd bring his daughter, Emily. She'd sit nearby sketching birds while he worked, and sometimes she'd hum the tune of "You Are My Sunshine." She didn't know it was her grandmother's song. The melody had just found her, the way truth finds its way through generations. One evening, after finishing the last plank, David sat on the edge of the dock and watched his reflection tremble in the water. "You got what you wanted, Dad," he said quietly. "But I think you also gave me what I needed." Then he tossed a handful of pebbles into the lake, each splash sounding like a syllable of closure. In town, people began to notice the change. The man who once arrived in polished shoes now wore work boots and carried toolboxes instead of excuses. He started fixing things around the shelter, the leaky roof, the playground fence, the old swing Maggie used to talk about building. The volunteers adored him but never quite understood why he never took credit for anything. 5 years after my death, James visited the cabin to finalize the transfer. He told me later, again, in the imagined way the dead listen to stories, that David didn't even open the envelope at first. He simply placed it on the mantel beside my photo and said, "It can wait." Some debts don't expire when the paperwork says so. That night, he sat at the piano I'd moved there years before, the same one Maggie loved. He pressed a single key, the note trembled in the empty room. Then another and another until the tune formed, rough, hesitant, but unmistakable. "You Are My Sunshine." He didn't play for inheritance or memory. He played for forgiveness. In the months that followed, the shelter expanded. The scholarship fund grew thanks to community donations sparked by David's quiet dedication. Reporters asked about the name Margaret Rivers. He always smiled and said, "She was my mother, though she lived under another name when she was happy." He never once mentioned me publicly. That was part of our unspoken agreement. I hadn't wanted a monument, I'd wanted understanding. And that, finally, he had. One summer evening, Emily asked him, "Dad, why do we always bring flowers to Grandma's grave?" He thought for a long time before answering. "Because love isn't what you say when someone's here. It's what you keep doing when they're gone." She nodded, not fully grasping the weight of it yet, but someday she would. From where I am now, wherever that is, I like to think I still watch the lake. Some nights I imagine the moonlight on the water, the dock creaking under their feet, the sound of laughter where once there had been silence. I don't regret anything. People call what I did revenge. I call it symmetry. It wasn't about taking something away. It was about returning things to their rightful places. Maggie used to say life's like music. Too many people rush the tempo, not enough listen for the rest between notes. My revenge was that rest. The pause that finally let the song resolve. And now, when the wind moves through the lilacs by the old house, the ones I planted before I left, I hope it carries her scent to him. Not as guilt, but as grace. Because grace, unlike inheritance, can't be signed away. If you asked me now whether I forgave him, I'd tell you forgiveness was never the goal. Understanding was. Forgiveness follows understanding the way dawn follows the night. You don't summon it, it just arrives when the dark has done its job. By the time autumn came again, David took Emily to the lake every weekend. They'd light a fire, roast marshmallows, and he'd tell her stories about a man who built a house out of love and nearly lost it to pride. He never said the man's name. He didn't need to. And as the firelight flickered on their faces, somewhere beyond the trees, I swear the lilacs bloomed one last time before winter, their fragrance drifting across the still water like a benediction. Death came quietly, like a long-forgotten song humming through an open window. I didn't fight it. After all, what was there left to resist? My work was done. The pieces were set, the world would play its part. That morning, the sky was a pale, forgiving blue, the kind of color Maggie loved. I dressed neatly, the way she'd have wanted, pressed shirt, clean shave, her wedding ring on a chain around my neck. I brewed one last cup of coffee and carried it out to the porch. The lilacs were in bloom, heavy with perfume. The wind was soft. I thought about David somewhere out there, probably rushing between meetings or bills or whatever occupied the heart of a man who had forgotten what really mattered. I wondered if, when the call came, he'd feel a pinch of grief or just inconvenience. But that didn't matter anymore. The ache in my chest began gently. Not a stab, not even fear, just a reminder that time was collecting its due. I sat back, let the morning sun warm my face, and said softly, "It's all right, Maggie. You can take me home now." The cup fell from my hand and shattered on the wood. And then there was only stillness. They said I went peacefully. James found me first. He'd come by to drop off a few final papers. The neighbors gathered outside, whispering the way people do when death visits someone they thought immortal simply because he'd been there so long. Within hours, word reached David. He arrived 2 days later, Rachel beside him, though their hands never touched. She looked smaller than I remembered, worn thin by whatever life had demanded in the years since our last conversation. He, too, had changed. The arrogance was gone from his face, replaced by something harder to define, a quiet panic, maybe, or shame wearing the mask of composure. The house smelled faintly of lilacs and dust. My photo stood beside Maggie's on the mantel, both of us frozen mid-laughter. I imagine the sight must have stung, 2 ghosts smiling at the man who had missed our goodbyes. James met him in the living room, calm and deliberate. "Your father left very clear instructions," he said. He handed over the envelope I'd sealed months ago, my will, the keys, the letter, the photo of David at 10 years old holding that ridiculous fish he'd been so proud of. When his eyes landed on the title The Margaret Rivers Home for Women and Children, he blinked. Once. Twice. And then, for the first time since he was a boy, he said my name aloud, not Dad, not old man, but Tom. "What is this?" he asked. "Your father's estate," James replied simply. He read in silence at first, jaw tightening, breath quickening as the words sank in. The house, gone to the foundation. The savings, divided between a scholarship and the shelter. The cabin, bound by conditions of love and time. Every line was a mirror, showing him who he had become. Rachel tried to protest. "This isn't legal. He can't just..." James interrupted gently. "He can. He did. Contesting it will void everything." David stared at the will, as if reading might somehow rewrite it. "He planned this," he whispered. "Yes, I did, son. Every word. Every pause." He folded the document and left without saying another word. I watched him from wherever I am now, that strange distance between presence and memory, as he stood by his car for nearly 10 minutes, gripping the steering wheel like it was the only solid thing in the world. Then he drove, not toward the city, but toward the lake. The cabin hadn't changed. I'd made sure of that. The porch still creaked, the old flannel still hung by the chair, and on the table waited the cassette player, and the note that simply read, "Press play." He hesitated, then pressed the button. My voice, rough with static, filled the room. "If you're hearing this, I'm gone. I didn't leave you wealth, David, I left you the weight of meaning. Money disappears. Houses crumble. But regret lasts just long enough to teach you something." I could almost see him standing there, his eyes glistening, that flicker of recognition softening his face. "You think I punished you. I didn't. I gave you time. 5 years to be exact. One for every year you ignored what really mattered. Visit her grave, son. Talk to her. Remember her voice. If you can do that, not out of guilt but out of love, then you'll earn what's left of us." The tape clicked off. He didn't move for a long while. The light through the window shifted from gold to gray. Then, at last, he sat down and whispered something I couldn't quite hear, but I like to think it was "I'm sorry." That night, He drove straight to the cemetery. It was past sunset when he reached her grave. The grass was wet, the air heavy with summer rain. He knelt, placed a single white rose on the stone, and whispered her name. Maggie. He stayed until the first birds began to sing. Then he left, and came back again the next year. From where I watch, I've had the strange privilege of seeing years unfold like pages turning themselves. The second year, he brought his daughter, Emily. She asked why her grandmother didn't have a picture on the stone, and he told her. Because some faces belong in memories, not marble. She laughed, and he did too. The sound carried farther than the wind. By the third year, the house I donated was open and running. The shelter was full of life, children drawing with crayons, women cooking meals, the smell of bread and soap mixing in the air. David started volunteering there once a week. He told no one who he was. He fixed broken chairs, painted walls, repaired the fence out back. He never missed a shift. One of the women told James, "There's a man who works here like he's paying off a debt to someone he loves." And maybe he was. By the fifth year, the shelter's anniversary drew the local paper. There was a photograph of David standing under the sign, "The Margaret Rivers Home for Women and Children." His hand rested on Emily's shoulder. He looked older, gentler. The reporter asked for a quote, and he said, "My father taught me that justice isn't revenge, it's responsibility. Sometimes it just takes a lifetime to understand the difference." I could have left the story there, content in its symmetry. But life, or whatever follows it, has a way of completing what we begin. That winter, James visited him at the cabin with a final envelope. Inside was the deed, and one last letter. 5 visits, 5 years, 5 chances. You kept everyone. The cabin is yours now, but remember, this was never about property. This was about presence. You gave it back to her, and that means you've earned it. Use this place well. Fill it with laughter again. That's all the revenge I ever wanted. He read it 3 times before folding it carefully and tucking it into his coat pocket. Then he walked out to the lake, snow crunching under his boots, and looked at the reflection of the sky in the frozen water. The world was quiet still, the same stillness that had greeted me the day I left it. He said, "I understand now, Dad." And that, at last, was enough. Now, from wherever I rest, I no longer think of what was taken. I think of what was returned. I see the house filled with laughter from children who've never known cruelty. I see the scholarship winners hanging her picture in their dorm rooms. I see David walking through the shelter garden, touching the lilac branches with the same tenderness she once had. Revenge was never the destination. It was the road back home. Maggie used to say that grief is just love that doesn't know where to go. Well, mine found its way, through signatures and silence, through time and patience, until it became something purer than forgiveness, understanding. If love is an inheritance, then I finally passed mine on, not in dollars, but in decency. And when the wind moves across the lake at night, carrying the scent of lilacs toward the porch, I like to think he breathes it in, closes his eyes, and knows his father never hated him. His father only wanted him to remember. Because that's what justice really is, love, finally growing up. Years have no meaning where I am now. They pass like wine through tall grass, soft, shapeless, endless. But I still remember the world of clocks and mornings, of coffee steam and tired hearts. I remember what it was to love someone so fiercely that even death couldn't convince you to stop trying to reach them. Sometimes, in whatever this place is, I feel the pull of the earth, faint, familiar. It's like hearing a favorite song from another room. And when I follow that sound, I see him. David. He's older now. The lines on his face are no longer born of ambition or worry, but of work, honest work. The kind that stains your hands and cleanses your conscience. His hair has gone silver at the temples, the same shade mine turned the year his mother fell ill. And when he laughs, which he does more often now, I hear the echo of her joy in it. He never remarried after Rachel passed. The illness that once bound them in desperation finally took her, gently, one spring. He held her hand through the end. Maybe that's when he learned what I had known all along, that love and loss are twins, inseparable, each giving the other its shape. After she died, he didn't retreat into sorrow. He built. He kept the cabin, of course. His own hands repaired the roof and sanded the floors. The piano stands by the window now, freshly tuned. On weekends, he teaches Emily's children, my great-grandchildren, to fish, to hammer nails straight, to play a few broken notes of You Are My Sunshine. The house is never silent anymore. He visits the shelter often. Sometimes he just sits in the garden, talking quietly with the women there, listening to their stories. They say he's kind but reserved, that he donates tools instead of speeches, and that he smells faintly of cedar and lake water. When people thank him, he always smiles and says, "You're thanking the wrong man." That's how I know the lesson took root. The world, too, has carried traces of Maggie's grace. The scholarship fund we built grows every year. There's a wall inside the local college covered with photos of the students it's helped, doctors, artists, teachers. A plaque beneath it reads, "In memory of Margaret Rivers Thompson, who believed kindness is never wasted." Sometimes, when the graduates gather for their annual dinner, they play an old recording of her favorite song. None of them know why that melody matters, they just feel that it does. And maybe that's enough. I often think about the nature of revenge. How simple it seems when you're angry, how quiet it becomes once it's done. The truth is, revenge was never the point. It was only the doorway. Beyond it waited understanding, not just for him, but for me too. When Maggie died, I thought the world had ended. What I didn't realize was that I had mistaken endings for beginnings. Her death wasn't the closing of our story, it was the start of the lesson we were meant to teach together. She through love, and I through consequence. Together, we made something that endured. There are nights when the veil between here and there feels thin, and I swear I can smell her lilacs again. We walk through the garden sometimes, she and I, at least, that's how I imagine it. Her hand in mine, soft as it was when we first danced in the kitchen 40 years ago. We don't talk much. We don't have to. She looks toward the cabin, toward the light glowing faintly in the window, and smiles. "He remembered," she says. "Yes," I answer. "He did." We watch him from afar, his family gathered by the fire, Emily's youngest boy chasing fireflies, laughter mixing with the hum of summer. The world feels right again. Balanced. Not perfect, it never is, but whole. And in that wholeness, I finally understand what forgiveness truly means. It isn't saying it's all right, it's saying it happened, and I choose to stop carrying it. I think David found his version of that too. He never tried to rewrite what was lost. He just learned to live honestly in what remained. That's the quiet miracle of time. It teaches through patience what punishment never could. One evening, if you can call it that where I am, I see him walk to the edge of the lake alone. The water reflects the twilight like polished glass. He sits on the dock and pulls a small box from his pocket. It's dented, old, the same tin box I buried beneath the lilac tree years ago. He must have found it after I was gone. He opens it and takes out the 2 wedding rings, still wrapped in Maggie's silk scarf. For a long while, he just holds them, turning them in the fading light. Then he stands, wades knee-deep into the water, and lets them fall. The rings sink slowly, glinting as they go, until the ripples swallow them. He whispers, "Thank you?" And then he smiles, the same tired, genuine smile I wore the morning I left the world behind. That's when I feel it, the final release. A soft untying of every knot I've carried. No bitterness, no regret, only stillness. The kind that feels like music ending on the right note. People like to say justice is blind. But I think that's wrong. Real justice sees everything, even the pain it causes. It watches quietly, makes sure the wound turns into wisdom, and only then does it step aside. What I gave him wasn't vengeance. It was a map. It led him through shame, through reflection, through love, all the way back to himself. And now, when the moon rises over the lake, the reflection doesn't look like mine anymore. It looks like his. That's how you know a story is complete, when the person you once hoped to punish becomes the person you finally forgive. Maggie leans her head against my shoulder. Do you think he'll remember us? I smile. He already has. The wind picks up, carrying the scent of lilacs across the water. Somewhere below, the rings rest together in the silt, patient, eternal. I take her hand, and as the world drifts away, I whisper the last truth I've learned. Revenge ends when love remembers its purpose. And with that, the light folds around us, warm, endless, and kind. If this story moved you, please support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and leaving a comment with your thoughts. To continue the journey, click the box on the left for the next story. Thank you for being here.